A favorite target of third-wave feminist criticism is a feminist book, Betty Friedan's 1963 groundbreaking work, The Feminine Mystique. The Feminine Mystique is a book that's launched numerous feminist careers by acting as a punching bag. It's been excoriated as racist, classist, homophobic, and based on lies. And that's just in one article. Yeah, okay, the feminine mystique is not especially relevant to non-white, gay, or trans women, but no single book can be all things to all people. Betty Friedan's point was to highlight the misery of women who, on the surface, had everything going for them. Something was going on in post-war America that remained meaningful, even when you filtered out the racism, homophobia, and xenophobia of the superficially idyllic 1950s. I'm going to approach the feminine mystique for what it is, not what it's not. Much like de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, Betty Friedan broke new ground with her books, so we can't expect it to be anywhere near perfect. Some of it has been debunked, some of it is out of date, but I'm going to show you some portions of the book that remain surprisingly predictive and relevant today, over 50 years after its original publication. In fact, there was so much to cover, I had to split it into two parts. The mind can absorb what the strategically covered butt can endure, after all. The story behind the feminine mystique goes like this. Betty Friedan was an alumnus of Smith College, a women's liberal arts college, and conducted a survey of her classmates. The results of this survey made it clear to Friedan that her own dissatisfaction with her comfortable but boring conventional middle-class life was shared by other women. These women defined themselves mostly as housewives, even if they did some work, because back then, women commonly got fired when they got pregnant, if they didn't leave work voluntarily. Ironically, the newspaper that fired Friedan when she was expecting her second child was a left-wing union publication. Historically, the political left has been better regarding the advancement of women than the right, but that doesn't mean it's embraced the concept with open arms. Betty Friedan called this housewife unhappiness the problem that has no name. Symptoms included heavy use of diazepam, which inspired the Rolling Stones song Mother's Little Helper. Friedan started shopping around articles about her findings, but she had trouble finding publishers. This added to her previous observations as a freelance writer that women's magazines would minimize elements of articles that dealt with women in roles other than homemakers. The excuse then was the same one it is now for marginalizing a given group or topic. Our readers aren't interested in that. Betty Friedan's major in psychology helped her find the words for her circumstances that other women couldn't. Her politicized writing career had trained her to be persuasive, and her childhood experiences with anti-Semitism made her acutely aware of injustice and bigotry. These skills, 5 years of work, research into media and advertising, and numerous interviews with other suburban housewives produced the feminine mystique. The feminine mystique's combination of Friedan's powers of persuasion and carefully curated facts served as a wake-up call to American middle-class suburban white women that sparked the country's second wave of feminism. Simone de Beauvoir had written The Second Sex to inform. Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique to engage. The feminine mystique deals with a phenomenon we define today as women self-selecting out of power careers to focus on marriage and family. The reality Friedan identified then, and that's still at play today, was that this self-selection happened under heavy amounts of social pressure and media messaging. Women were convinced by magazines, marketing, and even schools allegedly for them that they would be happiest as wives and mothers. And then they found out that they weren't happy at all. The prevailing wisdom of the time was that women should be educated so they can argue with their husbands, something enshrined in multiple TV shows of the time. Women were being put through post-secondary education to improve their marriage prospects with intelligent men, then forced to spend large portions of the day alone while the kids were at school and the husband was at work. And we didn't see this as a recipe for disaster. In only a decade, the ideal for women had gone from this to this. Betty Friedan noticed that because women weren't challenged in the same way men were, the women of her generation never fully matured. Society, thanks in part to the influence of Sigmund Freud, perpetuated the idea that women were inherently and insurmountably childlike. This created a cycle where unchallenged women became more childlike, then demanded fewer challenges, perpetuating the assumption that women were naturally childlike. Part of the reason for this was that there were only so many jobs to go around, and the powers that be were worried what would happen to men who returned from war only to face unemployment. Of course, we're facing that today with employers unwilling to hire Iraq and Afghanistan veterans over fears of PTSD. But back in the 1950s, the world was recovering from a double trauma: the poverty of the Great Depression, followed by the perpetual fear of World War II and the Cold War. A collective regression took place. Everybody wanted their mommies. Women, therefore, were pressured to become everyone's mommy. The propaganda shifted from, "You can do men's work, ladies," to, "Yeah, but we all know you're happier at home." We're seeing similar conditions today: prolonged economic downturn coupled with the global fear of terrorism. And so we have a culture war where large portions of society want to return to the days of family values when men were men. The thing is, this attitude doesn't learn from the past. 1950s masculinity wasn't especially healthy either. Men were increasingly discouraged from displaying emotion. Depression became a common secret shame, and alcoholism skyrocketed. Use of alcohol started declining with the Industrial Revolution because sobriety made working heavy machinery safer. But after Prohibition in the U.S. was repealed in 1933, alcohol consumption steadily increased again until it peaked in 1982. Yes, America elected Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan while voters were sauced. Meanwhile, millions of women found out that they weren't, in fact, happier at home, even though every message directed at them told them they should be. The more advertisers tried to make housework seem like a profession, the more women, deep down, realized something was rotten in the state of Betty Crocker. The reason that the 1950s art styles and the Fallout and BioShock games are so effective is that North American society was gripped by a huge pervasive lie back then. So it just kind of makes sense that these decades would be the backdrop of a grisly, cynical apocalypse. Back in the real world, experts believe that the repression of this time contributed to the high rates of addiction among the baby boom generation. An entire wave of people were raised with a lack of healthy emotional processing skills. The DuPont slogan of the time, "Better living through chemistry," might sum up the attitudes of that generation. And these are the very same people claiming that video games rot your brain. But back then, it was a very real thing that Friedan outlined at length in The Feminine Mystique. In gamer terms, housework and child rearing went from games women played through just for the story to 100% completion platinum trophy territory. Housework expanded to fill the available space in a woman's life, and cooking and cleaning became such arduous, unnecessarily complicated tasks that women were constantly exhausted and didn't have enough hours in the day to get it all done. The so-called natural role for women had become a thoroughly unnatural compulsion. In order to keep women in the home, housework had to become more complicated to fill the void left by industrially produced foods, improved cleaning equipment, and smaller houses. No longer was it adequate to change bed sheets once a week. No, some women started changing sheets 2, even 3 times a week, convinced that any less was dirty. Towels were laundered after one use because a wet towel was disgusting. It was an environmentalist nightmare. On top of that, dinners became ordeals that required hours-long preparation. Dusting was unending as Sisyphus pushing that rock. Baking required lab-level chemistry knowledge and hands as steady as a surgeon. Every new labor-saving device somehow managed to create more work. And there was a reason for this that Betty Friedan uncovered through interviews with advertising agencies. Ad agencies didn't want women working outside the home because working women shopped less. Shopping filled a void in a homemaker's unstimulating, lonely life. To encourage shopping, advertisers presented homemaking as an unpaid profession full of false complexities. Instead of 3 cleaning products, a woman was convinced she needed 12. Instead of a single sewing pattern that could be adapted to multiple looks, patterns became more specific and unnecessarily complicated. A cake mix or a new appliance didn't mean a woman had to work less. The expectation was now 3 types of cookies instead of just 1. More side dishes at dinner, floors rewaxed multiple times a week, and when advertisers hit a limit on how much work they could add, they started marketing products as ways women could spend more time with their kids. Even the structural designs of homes changed. In the days of servants, laborers paid, albeit meagerly, to do household chores. kitchens were built away from the main living spaces, separated from the dining room by hallways. In the 1950s, the era of the open concept house, the kitchen was placed in a central location off both the dining room and the living room. But as women got back into the workforce, the walls went back up, and by the 1970s, kitchens were separated from non-food living spaces again. In the 1950s, white women were living an engineered life that had been designed to get them to spend money, but not earn money. The feminine mystique presented femininity as a form of mind control, and it woke up America. What shocked so many white women was that they'd been totally unaware that they weren't doing anything natural, even though black women had been pointing this out unnoticed since first-wave feminism. And marketers had been pushing this spend your husband's money lifestyle to try to paper over another reality. Though women had been forced back into the home to give men returning from war back their jobs, men had been taking over female domestic responsibilities for hundreds of years by turning work done in the home into work done as a business. Human agriculture is at least 8,000 years older than currency, so the idea of paid versus unpaid labor wasn't an issue when the basics of human gender roles were set. Men's work and women's work were, as best we can tell, separated mainly by location. While men's work tended to roam and focus on resource gathering, women had processing work and stayed closer to home. In fact, in the days before matches, women had the important task of keeping the fires going. Have you ever tried to start a fire the old-fashioned way? Holy crap, it's hard. Compensation was simple back then. You worked in the food supply, you got a portion of that food supply. Trade expanded upon that idea. Anyone who's done trading in a video game knows the basics of this. You trade something you have a lot of for something you don't have any of. The value of a thing is dependent on how much you need it, and how big a jerk a Civilization 5 AI wants to be on a given day. Broad strokes, currency was designed initially as an extension of that system. Money was food credits, so to speak. But two things started to happen as societies became more structured and trade routes got more established. Early money was most important from those farthest from the food processing sources, meaning it was more associated with man's work. And religions started shifting from polytheistic faiths with priests and priestesses to monotheistic religions with a male god and exclusively male spiritual leaders. Religious buildings were often the places where the grain was stored, so whoever controlled the temple controlled the food. So the shekel rose with ethical monotheism. Man's work became associated with paid work, whereas women's work was unpaid. Food, however, was still prepared within the sphere of the home, because that's where those fires were. The Romans, however, made baking a prestigious popular art. It was something someone could become famous for, so baking became a respectable profession. In other words, baking became man's work, work done outside the home. Rome, after all, was a society where women had extremely limited public roles. Yeah, that's right. Bread was a delicious agent of patriarchy. So delicious. After that, food processing increasingly shifted from being woman's work to man's work. As populations moved away from farms and into cities, food increasingly became something you paid for instead of something you prepared yourself. Butchers, bakers, and milkmen came between the farms and the kitchens. The World Wars accelerated this phenomenon because baking schools in many places got closed down. A lack of skilled bakers meant baked goods were increasingly produced with chemicals aided by machines. Food production by Betty Friedan's time was industrialized, culminating in the 1953 invention of the C.A. Swanson and Sons TV dinner. Women were making clothing in garment factories owned by men instead of making their families' clothes exclusively at home. Unpaid women's work was increasingly transferring into paid men's work, and with that shift came the idea that men's work was worth more than women's work. Men were seen to be supporting their families, as if diapers got changed and kids got fed entirely on their own. Men's work was public and therefore visible. Women's work was in the home and therefore invisible. A side effect of this invisibility was reduced adult socialization, and women became dependent on their husbands for mental and emotional stimulation, as well as the basic necessities of life. Women were dependents, but those dependents who had worked during World War II remembered what it was like to hold a job. The war years had been very hard, but they'd been satisfying. Unfortunately, the war years also set the standard that it was okay to pay women significantly less than men for doing the exact same job. A woman's earnings were seen as pin money, extra cash she could spend on luxuries, whereas a man's wages paid for family necessities. These social roles were setting the pattern for women's work outside the home being seen as inherently worth less than men's work. Some scientists believe that this division continues to this day. A massive 2009 study that looked at labor statistics from the 1950s to the new millennium found that as women begin to outnumber men in a skilled profession, the pay drops. But when men overtake women in a field, the pay rises. For example, computer programming used to be considered menial labor when computer programmers were predominantly women. But as more men started working in computers, the prestige and the salaries associated with computers rose. On the other hand, life sciences like biology, which are now female-dominated, have far lower salaries than technology jobs, which are male-dominated, even though the life sciences require just as much education and training. These sorts of bias phenomenon are estimated to account for more than half of the gendered compensation gap. So women on average are making 10 to 12% less than men before factoring in hours worked, salary negotiations, and the estimated 9% of the pay gap that's flat out pure discrimination. As always, why does this matter? Because kids of single mothers are significantly more likely to live in poverty, and everyone can agree that child poverty is bad. If these researchers are right, and women are being paid less simply because society thinks female-associated work isn't worth as much, the long-term solution to the pay gap isn't for women to start self-selecting into higher-paying fields. The pay will just drop as more women enter a given field. Despite innovations like Equal Pay Acts, Women in Science programs, and numerous watchdog organizations, the gendered wage gap for full-time salaried earnings has only decreased by 20 cents in half a century. In 1960, working women earned 59 to 64 cents for every dollar a man earned. Today, we're up to around 79 cents. Granted, this is an average of all women, so the gap is less for white women and more for Black and Hispanic women. It's less for rich women and worse for poor women, meaning that the people who need help the most aren't getting it. The element of pay inequity that directly contributes to poverty is the part that's relevant, not some catchy round number that makes rich white people care more. Just like in the 1960s, feminist PR is calibrated to make white people give a damn because they're in the best position to get anything changed. Unfortunately, those changes tend to primarily benefit white people. But there's another downside to women's work being valued less that affects men. Men get paid less than women in some of those lower-paying female-dominated professions, and they're socially ostracized in those jobs. The theory is that men who want to work in caregiver roles are seen as somehow weird or creepy. It's assumed that there has to be something wrong with the guy who wants to lower himself to do lesser work. It's considered aberrant for men to want to identify with childcare, which is a dangerous stigma that can cause psychological damage in men by separating them from the human instinct to care about kids, because kids are cute. Betty Friedan wrote extensively on why she thought women's work tended to be undervalued, but I don't want to dwell on this because too many people refuse to be convinced that there is anything at all to the compensation gap. This is sad, but it's a reality. So let's leave compensation there and move on to things that are less enthusiastically red-pilled by anti-feminists. We're going to take a look at how Chapter 7 of the Feminine Mystique may provide insight into a modern-day hot-button issue: university campus rape hysteria. That's next week. I need a break.